Well, thank you very much, everyone. So we're starting our second session today. So this session is on the themes of social, economic, and climate change. So the first speaker today is Professor Frank Vankley, Australian by birth. Frank is a professor of cultural geography at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Although a career of academic, his strong interest is on applied social research, and he's been heavily engaged also as an advisor on social issues, and especially on social impact assessment for several organizations, including the World Bank and many leading NGOs and governments. He's also been a long-standing member of the International Association of Impact Assessments and is a proud member of our community, where he's held many leadership positions. He's also the author of many key documents in the field of social impact assessment, including the very recent Handbook on Social Impact Assessment. He's also been the awardee of the prestigious individual award of IAIA back in 2014, where the IAIA community acknowledges his personal contributions to the field and the advancement of theory and practice of the discipline of social impact assessment. Professor Frank Vankley, he's a strong voice and a thought leader on the field of social impact assessment. Professor, it's an honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm not trying to sell you my book. I want to give it to you. It's an open access book. You can search for it and download it for free. It has 37 chapters written by a total of 50 authors, and they're the best practitioners for their particular topic. So this is a great book that I'm proud to have been able to edit. What I'm going to do today is give you a quick introduction to what social impact assessment is. I'm going to talk about social impact assessment in Europe. I'm going to talk about the concept of international standards and how social impact assessment fits in international standards, and then talk about how social impacts and social impact assessment is quite different to environmental impacts and EIA in lots of ways. So it's a very different concept altogether. So social impact assessment is my life's passion. I grew up in an area of Australia subject to a lot of development, and it made me really angry about how governments acted inappropriately in the way that development was being done. And that fostered my passion for social impact assessment. So I've been interested in social impact assessment since the 1970s. So social impact assessment is a field of research and practice. It's not a technique or a tool. It's a field of research and practice. It's a discourse, it's a discipline or a paradigm about how social impacts might be thought about, how they might be managed. And it's a group of people doing things. There's not so many academics in this field, actually. It's a shame, but there are thousands of practitioners around the world who do this, especially now, maybe not in so many decades past, but they assist projects at company level and hopefully also at government level to make things better for communities and for projects. There's quite a few guidance documents available to do this. The International Association for Impact Assessment guidance document. Various governments have guidance documents on social impact assessment, and even some development banks, this being the Inter-American Development Bank, having a guidance document. So lots of guides out there for how it will be done. The International Association for Impact Assessment has promoted social impact assessment in addition to environmental impact assessment and health impact assessment and strategic environmental assessment. And over the years, there's been a need for some codification of what this might be. So two documents are particularly important. In 2003, something called the International Principles for Social Impact Assessment. And in 2015, a handbook, we call it the reindeer document, a handbook on a guidance document for social impact assessment. Actually, both of these documents have been translated into many languages, including Portuguese. So social impact assessment, it's a funny thing, right? And over time, part of this discussion about, well, what is it exactly and what might the definition be? You can see here, this is a definition developed by a committee to resolve every dispute that's ever been had about this field. It's a definition that you'd never remember, but it includes, in the plural, meaning that actually it's not an exclusive definition. It could be more than this. The processes, also in the plural, because it's more than one process, of analyzing, monitoring, and managing the intended and unintended social consequences, both positive and negative, of planned interventions, right? So each one of these little statements, very important. And then the final one, and any social change processes invoked by those interventions, which is there to get people to realize it's more than just the first order consequence. Prior to many of the environmental impact assessments that are done, only think about what happens immediately. And particularly in the social world, this leads to this, leads to that, leads to this. Very important that you think about what happens after the first order consequences. So in this definition here, you'll see I've got social highlighted. But actually, if it was environmental impact assessment, you could almost say that this was a definition for EIA. To make it the definition for social impact assessment, that word social is particularly important. And one of the questions that always arises is, well, what is social? And social, of course, is everything. Social is everything that affects people, how they live, what they think about, how they feel. It's much more than just, demographic changes. One of the issues is how social issues get considered in an EIA is often completely inadequately woeful in terms of what they think of as being social impacts. Social impacts are things that can be experienced or felt in a corporeal or physical way, in a cognitive way, or in an emotional way, right? Psychosocial impacts are social impacts. And social impacts affect people as individuals. They affect families or households. They affect small groups of people. They affect communities of people, and even society as a whole. Social impact assessment started along with the establishment of the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969. In fact, it was very much part of the American NEPA. And as NEPA spread around the world, different countries adopted NEPA-like legislation. So in many countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Indonesia, and so on, social issues were very much part of that understanding of the environment. Unfortunately, other countries have chosen to interpret the environment only in biophysical ways, right? But the definition in law of the environment is critical for how social issues are considered. Sometimes very much involved, sometimes not at all involved. Sometimes social impact assessment would be done as part of EIA, and in fact, quite often we have the expression of ESIA, ESIA, Environmental and Social Impact Assessment. Some places we even have ESIA with a H, Environmental, Social and Health Impact Assessment, as a way of thinking about all the issues that should be considered. So just like environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment can be used to assist government regulatory agencies to make decisions about how or whether projects should be approved or not. However, the nature of social impacts and how people are affected means that SIA over time has shifted away from the EIA model of a regulatory tool to becoming much more a process of managing the social issues. In fact, even in EIA, intellectually, the concept was not just to predict the impacts. The whole point of doing an EIA is to better manage. And that's been very much part of how we think about social impacts and social impact assessment. It's a process of managing the social issues in a more effective way. And as I'll argue in a minute, actually social impacts are quite different from environmental impacts, and people are affected immediately. There's even a rumor about a project. So projects need to manage their social impacts from the very beginning all the way through. And one of the problems with the legal approach is the ability of a legal approach to better manage outcomes is quite limited. They basically can only say approve the project or not. Potentially some conditions, or in bank speak, conditionalities can be applied, but in general, that's the limit. And although there is a concept called EIA follow-up, it's largely not done. The whole emphasis in social impact assessment, however, is the ongoing management of the social issues throughout the life of the project. And that means that social impact assessment becomes quite of interest to companies, and they do this in order to manage their social risks and to have a better social and environmental management system. It becomes of interest to communities, particularly in situations where communities might actually have legal say over whether a project should go ahead or not. For example, Indigenous communities potentially have the right to free, prior and informed consent and can stop a project. Arguably, all communities should be able to have some sort of say over whether projects in their communities should go ahead. So communities need to be able to know what the impacts they are likely to experience will be, and therefore they have an interest in social impacts and SIA. Oftentimes, NGOs, they act not only in relation to environmental matters, and as we heard in previous talks, that plays a very important part, but so also too do NGOs contribute to helping communities make decisions about whether or not projects are in the best interests of communities or not. And finally, in this, what's taking place now is far more important perhaps than regulatory bodies is actually the funding bodies. Many banks now will not lend money for projects that do not observe human rights issues, that do not have positive environmental outcomes and positive social outcomes. So banks are making decisions about funding of projects based on input from environmental and social considerations, the whole ESG considerations. So many jurisdictions do require strong consideration of social impacts. I've listed some of the countries that actually do this. There are many more as well. In Europe, it's a much more complicated story. The EIA directive is actually very ambiguous on social. It's hardly mentioned at all, and how it's mentioned only would give rise to think about some social issues. A positive interpretation that would push those words might be able to include a greater consideration of social issues, but most jurisdictions tend to have a very narrow notion of those things. And there's very little guidance about what social issues should be considered within the EIA framework within the EIA directive and how that's implemented in a national context. Most European countries don't have any social requirement at all in their legislations, although a few, Finland, France, Germany, and Malta, are ones where potentially they do. Other countries are actually, and the Netherlands is one here, where they're almost opposed to a formal approach to social impact assessment, in that they argue that social issues should be considered as part of the normal planning process or as part of the political process, and that there's no need for a separate system, although potentially that's changing. However, in fact, here's an extract from the EIA directive's webpage, where you can see the only things that are being mentioned are population and human health on the top line there, and cultural heritage down the bottom. This is hardly what we mean by social impacts. Social impacts covers many more things than just that. At the European level, though, there's a much greater change afoot. One process of change is the increasing acknowledgement of the fundamental importance of human rights, and particularly of business and human rights. And the cover on the left here is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This lays out expectations for business. And by the way, business is basically defined as any organization, including a not-for-profit organization or even a government-owned organization. So they say the word business, but essentially it means any organization needs to consider its human rights issues. So the importance of this 2011 document and how it's been developing over time means that all organizations need to consider their human rights issues. And so the rise of the business and human rights agenda and human rights impact assessment, or human rights due diligence, has been alongside social impact assessment. So in the history of social impact assessment, there's been an interesting relationship between how does the human rights fit. In general, we've always argued that human rights are part of social impacts. And when we analyze what constitutes the human rights that are considered under due diligence processes in the business and human rights agenda, what we see is almost all of those human rights issues could be interpreted from a social lens. They are social impacts, and vice versa. Almost every social impact can be interpreted in human rights terms. So there's been quite a growing alignment between the two discourses of business and human rights due diligence, and social impact assessment. To the extent that impact assessment is an ex-ante process, human rights due diligence tends to be ex post. So there is a little bit of a separation in the sense that due diligence assessments happen after a project's underway, whereas social impact assessment considers all the human rights issues in an ex-ante way. But I would argue that social impact assessment is an ongoing process of managing the social issues anyway. The other international discussion that's been relevant is the rise of the modern slavery discussion. And the human rights due diligence and modern slavery discussions have led to new legislation within the European Union outside of the EIA perspective. And although, so this has recently passed legislation at the European level, unfortunately, in the development process, quite some sacrifices had to be made. So the people who were driving this corporate sustainability due diligence legislation were somewhat disappointed by how it got watered down, especially at the last minute. And it only passed by a slim majority, but it's an awareness of things to come. There'll be much more commitment to corporate sustainability due diligence and the embedding of human rights within corporate activities into the future. Okay, so in contrast to the law, you've probably realized by now I'm not a lawyer, right? And I don't have a legalistic sort of perspective either. In fact, most of the driving for social impact assessment is not at the legal level, it's at the community level. This is what communities expect. And this is also what is taking hold. So in the concept of international standards, actually it's a very vague notion, right? What is an international standard? You might say, well, it's some document that's developed to create some consistency by some entity with some level of legitimacy. And sometimes those organizations have greater legitimacy, like the International Organization for Standardization, or in other words, ISO, and ISO 14001, of course, an environmental management system has been very important for the embedding of environmental management and to some extent environmental impact assessment. And arguably social issues could be thought of as being part of how environment should be considered in an ISO 14000 process. But even ISO 9001, a quality assurance process, requires companies to think about how they manage their relationships with their clients and their customers and the community in general. And obviously, if they're creating social impacts, then this isn't very good for their quality assurance process. So a quality assurance process leads to improved outcomes in general. If we go beyond that notion of an international standard being a document, but think of it as being a generally agreed expectation about what should be done, then there's quite lots of ways in which we can think of what international standards might be, and I'll show you that in a minute. My last point just here is that whenever we think about international standards, invariably they are more stringent and higher expectation than what is reflected in law. So the way of thinking about this is to think about the concept of who is the regulator, right? And in the environmental impact assessment notion of the world, the regulator is the competent authority who is determining whether a project should be approved or not, and it's governed by what is in the law. But what we see everywhere is communities are protesting against projects that they don't think are fair or appropriate. And this pushback of communities against projects is evident in lots of ways. So what I'm suggesting to you is that the regulators of today are much more than the old-fashioned notion. So yes, national laws and regulations is the start of who are regulators, but beyond that, actually there are many other things. So for a start, every large company, multinational, this is in the extractive sector, you can see that, but in the extractive sector, these big corporations, they have policies at the corporate level, which they require to be implemented at each of their site levels. And when you analyze their policies at the corporate level, they're very positive and effective and, consistent with what people would expect. An analysis of what they say is quite rewarding in terms of, yes, they say lots of things. Whether or not it's implemented at site level or not is another matter. And quite often there's a lot of failure, perhaps. But at corporate level, they are committed to much higher levels of social, environmental, and good governance than would normally be given them credit for. At the industry level, there are industry umbrella bodies that also have very good policies, guidance documents that demonstrate commitment. And in fact, for this future of certain industries, it's really important that at the industry level, they control the bad actors, right? The mining industry, we will only have mining into the future if there are no bad mining companies. We're only going to have hydroelectric dams if there's no bad hydroelectric dams, right? We're only going to have an oil and gas industry if there's no bad actors. So each one of these industry level bodies is fully committed, and palm oil is another example. Each one of these bodies is fully committed to ensuring effective and proper environmental and social practices by their members. Lots of international organizations are promoting proper environmental and social management. Lots of international financial institutions, right? So these are the development banks. So you would expect that they would have environmental and social policies. But in fact, all banks do, I'm jumping ahead from, but all banks do through what's called the Equator Principles, right? So all industries have a sustainability framework. The sustainability framework for the world's financial institutions is called the Equator Principles, and most of the large banks in the world subscribe to the Equator Principles, and part of that is a commitment to ensure that they do not lend money for environmental or social harm. Now, the regulators also comprise the NGOs. It's not governments that take companies to court, by and large, for failure to do things, or at least if they do, it's only because of the pressure that NGOs have placed. So NGOs are really important in terms of ensuring adequate commitment to environmental and social activities, and particularly this group of NGOs called watchdog organizations, and you can see the word watch come up in many places. And finally, even individuals and small groups taking action can have an effect on the regulation of projects. Right. So what that means is all sorts of organizations at the international level are producing guidance documents or standards documents that collectively create something that we call the international standards. And these international standards generally can be reflected in various ways, but basically they're accepted by NGOs. They were produced in conjunction with input from NGOs. And this way of doing things becomes the default standard that's used by good companies, at least. It becomes the default standard used by the good engineering contractors. It becomes the default standard used by environmental consulting firms. And it becomes the default standard that's expected by academics in this field. And although there's many, you can see here that there are many documents that might be part of what we understand to be the concept of international standards. For convenience, we tend to say the IFC performance standards, right? The International Financial Corporation's performance standards are regarded as being the gold standard that's used. Actually, that used to be the case. Unfortunately, the IFC performance standards date from 2012. Almost every other organization, the banks and so on, have updated their performance standards since 2012. So the IFC performance standards, which we generally say are the gold standard, they're a bit out of date now, and they're under revision at the moment. So the IFC performance standards, here's a picture of the book that outlines them, and there's 8 that covers them. You can see they have high focus on social issues. There's Indigenous peoples, there's cultural heritage. A critical area of concern relates to where there's project-induced displacement and resettlement. There's also an area for community health and safety and security. But social and social impact assessment is implied throughout, especially because of what's called Performance Standard 1, the red risk management. So Performance Standard 1 is the overarching process of how environmental and social issues are considered, and social issues are widely covered in there. In addition to what's exactly stated in the performance standard exactly, Each IFC performance standard has a guidance note. And in addition to that, for the IFC and the World Bank and all the other banks, there's a personal relationship between the loan manager and the borrower. Part of the way that modern banking happens is there's a commitment that there's some level of, not coercion, but encouragement, leverage, right? So actually in human rights discourse, every organization has an obligation to apply leverage to make sure that there's proper consideration of human rights issues throughout the whole of the supply chain. So a bank interprets that as being the obligation that they have to their borrowers to ensure that their borrowers ensure that all human rights issues are adequately covered. So together with the standards and the guidelines, together with this extra leverage, what you would summarize the IFC performance standards as saying, or the IFC expectations of their clients, would be that every project has to have policies, procedures, and management systems in place to properly assess and manage all the social risks and impacts. They are expected to have ongoing, effective community engagement processes. No project is expected to take place if there's wide-scale opposition, right? So the language that's usually used is there's an expectation that there be broad-based support for any project. There's an expectation that all people affected by the project will be made better off, right? And the organization, the project is meant to ensure that any affected people, that they are made better off by having things like benefit sharing programs, social investment funding, and so on to make that work. There's meant to be a grievance redress mechanisms in place and effective monitoring and continuous improvement to ensure better outcomes. Okay, so just a quick reflection on what social impacts are and how they differ from environmental impact assessments. Every project creates social impacts, right? That's very evident when we're talking about new airports or extensions of airports or shifting an airport from one to another. That was like in the Netherlands. Every dam has impacts, every main road, every project has social impacts. And in fact, even good projects that are designed to create public benefit are still likely to have some degree of negative social impacts, right? So it's really important that every project development thinks about how they can manage their negative social impacts better. It's not good enough to say, in fact, it is one of the problems with the renewable field. The renewables say we're doing wonderful things, we're creating new, clean green energy, and therefore we don't have to worry about the social side. Well, unfortunately, that's false. They also have to consider about their social impacts. National parks get created and wind up displacing large numbers of people from where the national park's going to be, right? So there's terrible human rights harms in the name of good projects. So really important, greater awareness of the social impacts created by projects, especially the good ones, right? In the mining industry, they know that they're a bad industry and they're creating problem. In fact, curiously, that's why they're so committed and interested in ensuring better social outcomes. On the other side, we have these projects that are so-called good projects where they are blind to the fact that they potentially create negative social impacts. So that has to be changed. All projects can be better managed to reduce the negative social impacts they create. Now, when I'm talking about social impacts, I often say, well, they're just like, as social impact assessments, just like environmental impact assessment, except that it's dealing with the social issues. And when I say that, I'm usually presuming that people know what EIA is, although I'm increasingly finding out that that's not the case. And the other problem is actually social impacts are incredibly different to environmental impacts in lots of ways. Firstly, how we experience social impacts varies enormously on the characteristics of the project, the characteristics of the mitigation, the characteristics of the community. Some people can be willing for change and wanting new things to happen, and therefore quite forgiving of what might happen. Whereas other people are completely reluctant for any change to happen. So the characteristics of individuals. People's view of the project might change over time. Sometimes people are initially enthusiastic about it, and then they become pessimistic over time. Other people might be pessimistic beginning and become enthusiastic over time. Right? And people can be negatively and positively affected at the same time because different things are happening. And one of the most important things to realize is your perception of the legitimacy of the project completely affects how you experience the impact. If it's a project that's not legitimate, you will be very anti it and you'll experience the impacts. Whereas if it's a legitimate project that you're accepting of, then you generally will be accepting of any inconvenience that the project might create. So environmental impacts probably only happen the moment that construction starts, right? When the first sod of soil is turned. And actually what that means is environmental impact assessment procedures can take a long time, and they don't really have to be worried about what happens in that lead up phase. On the social side, however, social impacts happen the moment that there's rumor about a project, right? Imagine that it was suggested that a nuclear power plant might be built within a few kilometers radius of where you are based, right? This creates fear, anxiety, stress, mobilization of people. There are huge impacts that happen, not just intangible impacts like what I've just mentioned, but even very tangible ones like your property price is going to go up or down, right? If it's an undesirable project with no likely benefit, it will lead to a crash in the property price. If it means that there could be speculation and opportunism to be had, it could lead to an increase in property prices, right? So lots of things happen just on the level of rumor. And this leads to things that we call project-induced in-migration or influx, right? So in some countries in the world, hypothetically speaking, suppose there was a proposal for building a dam. Well, potentially that might lead to a huge influx of people who would then try to claim that they were resident there in order to benefit from the compensation that might be provided, right? In other situations, people will come in search of jobs. So this makes the whole process of predicting impacts quite difficult because project-induced immigration can mean that the inflow of people to a community can be far greater than the developer proponents' projections about the workforce that's going to be employed from outside, right? And in fact, a frequent area is EIA people who write their EIA reports. They often have got no idea about what's actually going to happen from a social perspective. Another issue is that there's a huge amount of speculation and opportunistic behavior that happens. Sometimes you might say this is legitimate. Sometimes you might say, well, it's legitimate given dissatisfaction with people. And sometimes it's completely illegal and corrupt particularly in relation to land transactions. Sometimes people in government who with using inside information will make land purchases in a way so that they can then sell it on at a much higher price later on. And an implication of that is that the people who are then displaced fail to get proper compensation that they would have if the project. Critical question, actually, especially in the land, in the sort of human rights notion, is all land has provenance, right? Every project, the question always has to be, what land will it be on, and how was the land obtained, and who was there before? So environmental impacts tend to be only negative. In fact, that camouflaged to some extent, or that influenced the way we thought about social impacts initially. But social impacts can be negative and they can be positive. They can be negative and positive at the same time, actually. And social impacts change with how people feel about a project. From an analysis of all of the social impacts, we often come to the realization that the second and higher order impacts tend to cause much more harm than the first order impacts. We realize that people are differentially affected, and the other part of it is that it's often very difficult to tell what's positive and what's negative. It might not be obvious in some ways. And the final observation is that fear and anxiety are major concerns of the project, and that people's perceptions about a project perception is reality, right? So in the environmental field, they tend to dismiss anything where they say perceived impacts, you know, they don't believe it, but perceived impacts are real because they affect how people feel and they affect how people behave, right? So perception is reality from the point of view of what people do. Because of how people are affected, they react to projects. They're pushed into fighting against projects to protect their rights and their livelihood. They might be opposed to a project not just because of the impacts they experience. They might be opposed to it because they're not legitimate from their point of view. So when we see protest actions, we should realize that protest is an expression of local community opposition, and it suggests that we should rethink how that project proceeds. And it's particularly important to be aware that how the company and or the agents acting on behalf of a company, security forces or the police, how they act can lead to an escalation or a de-escalation of how projects happen. So these are pictures from mining conflicts in South America. People get killed in these protests. Actually, through environmental defenders in the world, currently more than 200 people are being killed defending their home and environment every year, right? Even in Europe, this is Stuttgart in Germany on the 1st of October 2010, I think it was. 50,000 people protested against the starting of the construction of the new railway station there. This is a high quality image. You can see their faces. This is not some angry mob, you know, being a threat to anybody. This is concerned citizens exercising the democratic right to put their point of view across. Unfortunately, the police here brought out water cannon and over 100 people were hurt from that. So with a PhD student, we've analysed all the forms of protest. There's more than 200 different ways in which people can protest against projects. It's quite interesting. Part of the actions of communities is to strategize about how protest actually happens. And because of the harm that protest can create, lots of consequences can happen to projects, right? They can they can get in trouble. You know, actually, they're often doing things wrong, so they can lose their legal license to operate. They can be, they will incur lots of costs, lots of ways in which projects are affected. And because of all of those consequences to companies, what this means is social impact assessment is never a cost to projects. It will always lead to a better outcome. And I'm sure I'm well over time, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Frankly. I think we need to move on quickly to our next speaker. And so the next speaker is online. I just wanted to check first that Alexandra is with us. Just a sound check, please.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, okay, thank you, thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Alexandra Jirika-Pura. She's a senior researcher and a PI in the field of environmental planning. She specializes on climate change adaptation and mitigation in an interdisciplinary perspective. Her key research topics at the University of Natural Resources and Applied Life Sciences in Vienna include the much required and hot topic of consideration and integration of climate change impacts, both at the level of adaptation as well as at the level of mitigation and impact assessment. We will hear about climate change, but I must add on a personal note that she's also been delivering exciting presentations on the role of digitization and AI on impact assessment, and also on the topic of EIA process simplification. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Alexandra Jirika-Pura.
Thanks a lot. I'd really love to be in Lisbon with you. I have a lot of lovely memories of staying also at the University of Lisbon, exciting with the climate research group, but due to teaching obligations and also traveling to TU Berlin as a guest professorship, so I could not attend, but I'm happy to be virtually with you. And actually, climate change is one of the biggest challenges we face as a society, but also all of us somehow also in our private lives, in our professional lives. And a lot induced by climate change is also related to social topics. So it's linking also to the previous presentation directly. So a lot of poverty-related issues, health-related issues, strong issues on water resources and clean water and quantity of water. And I, however, will go back in my speech again a bit to the natural environment. So I want to link it similar to the last presentation in the first session on the strong interaction between climate and biodiversity. So we have these two huge crises, and I think it's also a reason why both climate and biodiversity were introduced as environmental issues at the same time, and also the guidance covering these topics in a way to interlink it. The question where to start in tackling climate change. So I will start from the project level. So we have EIA and appropriate assessment. It was already introduced a lot in the first sessions. I was also asked to then quickly touch also the consideration of climate change in SCA. And I think it's also very essential that we think about the links between plans and programs, especially if we have all these trade-off topics in renewable plannings, conflicting topics, and if possible, also social aspects to be considered even more there. But now starting from EIA, so our core topic of this conference, we started quite early, like 10 years ago already, to question us in the research groups in Austria and Germany, what's needed to consider climate change in EIA. And I will confront this with more recent research also. And it was not so surprising that data was a big issue, guidelines, and also the legal requirements. The legal requirements, they came then, so we have them in place since 2014 with the amendment of the Directive 52 on European Commission. And it's mandatory that they were integrated until 2016. And again, as Edwin showed us, here's the guidance also complementary to this introduction, which also thematically introduced these topics. So what does it mean? Both climate change and biodiversity, they were integrated as environmental issues introduced, and both of them therefore needed to be already considered during the screening phase, and then also in context with major accidents or disasters, which might be even more often occurring or more strongly occurring due to climate change. And to integrate this information in the, I'm sorry, because of my voice, I'm a bit, it's not so good today, a bit ill, but I hope it works throughout the presentation. Yeah, so to include this information, but also the information how the project itself affects global climate. So as a new topic in many countries, to think not only about meso and microclimate, but really the effect on the global climate. And so to start with, the focus was first a lot on the projects to see how they might be affected by climate change impacts directly or indirectly. So to say like landslides, rock falls, and these types of events. We differentiated a bit between direct impacts, so to say like infrastructure damage due to storms, increasing heavy rainfalls, or on the other hand, and this links us more to the environmental issues, like the trees falling on the high voltage lines, blocking roads, and also like increased soil erosion activities. So it links us already, and it was also mentioned before, in a very complex way between different environmental issues and how they interact, like water with soil and each other. And in Austria and Germany, but also in many other countries like in UK and Netherlands, the project developers, they were quite keen and quite early in finding out how their projects will be affected by climate change. And also in Austria here, we had a project even before the directive was introduced to see and elaborate the guidance, how EIA could deliver more data and help to mainstream an earlier consideration of climate change, and was also integrated then in this EU document. And it was also interesting, of course, to find out and to really analyze what are the threats. So we started from what were topics related to extreme events, which then might occur with different intensity, different frequency. And for Portugal, this looks a bit different, of course. So you would have the storm floods, you would have more coastal erosion and other activities. In Austria and Germany, there was already a draft as an upcoming topic, and heavy rainfall, of course, is a most important topic with all its variants of floodings and landslides and all these different impacts. And these impacts are somehow already related to the environment and the surrounding issues. But what we also started to discuss, and what I want to point out even more in connection with the biodiversity crisis, is also the changes in the sensitivity of different environmental issues. So such as the huge effect climate change has on species which are more in alpine areas, which are very susceptible to drying out habitats like amphibians, changes in migratory behavior, and especially also for water species and their habitats, these extreme changes which are due to different oxygen levels, different temperatures, And all of this is something new, which at the beginning we tried to more, and also when we spoke with all different groups of actors involved, it was always the same, that it's a very complex system, and even climate change itself is quite complex, and then the impacts of it on the natural conditions is even more complex. But what does it mean in practice? So we saw that there are some quite easy things or more easy things to consider. For instance, when we think about mitigation measures, so if we think about soil erosion, we might be able to consider in a different way how to put access routes, how to prevent extensive erosion, or we might think about in revegetation, whether we have different species composition, when we have different stress of drought, for example. If we have heavy rainfall in combination with drought, and this increases also the likelihood that it's washed out again very quickly, and we have different periods maybe of time to survey what we implement as measures. Or if we look at species directly, we might have different heat stress to animals, also in combination with drought. And we might be, it might be necessary to think what the effects of barriers such as streets or railway dams do to them, and also to think how tunnels or bridges for them to cross them and to access water resources, for instance, how this might change, and where we need to reflect also different conditions and changing conditions. Or to think of compensation measures where, for amphibians, for instance, some habitats might try out immediately if they are on a bad location where it's not suitable for them and it doesn't work at all. And it links me also to this data topic, because a long time we were discussing that it's too, and especially when we think about legal decisions, and where we really need reliability and good data and standards. We were a lot of time discussing that we don't have enough data on species migration, on all the different habitats and changes, and also on other topics like the susceptibility to pests in forests, or the likelihood for forest fires to start, and so on. And this just a quick shift to the topic which was also in the introduction mentioned, that now we have a variety of different opportunities by other ways of data collection, and also the support of artificial intelligence in their analysis. So it was at this year's IIA conference already a topic, and it will be a major topic at the next one. And it would be a topic on its own to speak about more, but just briefly at this time also introducing that we have a special issue also on these topics. And I think if we speak about these complex topics of climate change, biodiversity crisis, and so on, we really can, it was also a question I saw in the chat before in the first session, whether this helps us. But on the other hand, from a legal perspective, we see that we definitely lack standards, how to cope with these novel ways. So we have standards for on-site data collection, for instance, for birds or other species, but we still in many countries don't have standards how to deal with bioacoustic data, and for how long periods they need to be tracked, or also for the usage of artificial intelligence. So this is also a strong change also in the way if this can be some part of commissioning processes then later on. Yeah, but coming back to climate change and tackling it as a complex topic, we saw that quite early there was the interest, as I said before, from those who are project developers. And so these are represented more on the right as a group of people who were also involved in many research projects and practical. And on the other hand, we have the environmental authorities who are struggling with all these data issues and complexity, and also how far this could be considered in legal decision making then. And on the other hand, the consultants in between, so to cope with these novel topics as much as possible, and nevertheless keeping the legal standards. In Austria and Germany, we developed a toolkit then jointly. So all these actors who you saw here and some more, and try to approach the topic as easy as possible in a way of showcasing impacts by climate change on different projects subject to EIA, and then also to showcase how the environmental issues will be affected and will change, and also what might be mitigation measures which might need some adaptation, which might need to have different monitoring to look how they work out. And fortunately, this could also be integrated then into the main guidance documents. So in Austria, this really encouraged that all these actors were involved to, then also use this data and information more. Now I jump more to the international level, and this is a graph from a project from the German Environment Agency we were carrying out for them, looking at what are the most the research topics in the forefront from the three most cited journals in our field community. And that we saw that for a very long period, so climate change was really on the top. Now it's even digitalization and others which move more ahead. Many of these studies, nevertheless, they just treat it quite superficially. So they treat it, is it covered or not? And we see that the really substantial dealing with this topic is still quite complex. I show one study here, which gives also, if you're interested, a very broad overview about how far climate change is considered in, I think it was over 30 countries. And they adapted a framework from Lone Konoff and colleagues from Denmark. And they come to the result, there are different levels of climate change integration. And then they came to the result that most actually have some kind of partial integration. So they somehow, in some parts of the process, they consider it, but it's not throughout all steps of environmental impact assessment, or also only very few had this, what they called like a radical integration, where they also have climate change mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And also really carried it out with concrete climate data, because often the lack of climate data and climate projections was also is also a reason why it's just a very partial integration so far. We see it also from other international experience that still there's this justification topic. How relevant is the impact of one single project on greenhouse gas emissions? So this is still a very crucial topic to find the argumentation that it still matters, even if it's just one project with its impacts, and also how the scope of the greenhouse gas emission calculations is delimited. So we saw the example in the morning from the Netherlands, where the calculations were also wrong. And of course, this is sometimes really crucial how it's how the scope is, where the boundaries are taken and what is included and what is not included anymore. So a lot of differences between the countries, and also the way how it's done. And of course, this is also due to partly there came out guidance, but still it's a topic which is highly complex for some issues. from legal, I'm also not a lawyer and not I'm a planner, but it's also very interesting to see the interpretations from legal colleagues, and this is from Germany, where we saw that it changes more towards, in the first years, it was more the uncertainty in the forefront, and that you cannot really foresee what climate change impacts will be. But now we see, as this statement says, if as a result of climate change additional damage is probable or major damage is only possible, these must be taken into account even if there are still no scientifically validated forecasts of the exact probability or extent of the additional damage. So it's going more that we cope with uncertainty and that we nevertheless need to consider climate change and its probable effects. And to conclude with EIA and climate change, I now bring some examples from around the globe, starting with my home country, Austria, and introducing what we have as a kind of climate and energy concept, it's named. And it was actually established 15 years ago, and it's a mandatory part of the EIA, but nevertheless, it's still not a final decision criteria. So in Austria, we have this one-stop shop principle, and we have different matters like forestry and water and all of these issues. And they are really relevant for the final commissioning, whether the project can be implemented or not. But as climate change has no law on its own, and it's not a really final criteria then. So this makes it similar to the experiences from Canada, also very difficult that one single project has a meaning then and its impacts on climate change in the final decision. On the contrary, I show an example from UK, from a Northern Line extension. It's an underground line, and where we found it as quite a good example that greenhouse gases were taken also from scope 1 to scope 3 levels, so even indirect emissions outside the core underground activities, such as the waste disposal, and all these activities were taken into account. Now I jump to Germany, and we see here an example where also the relevancy of certain habitats as carbon sinks were considered. So quite a good link between climate change and also biodiversity related issues. And it's an example where they created real transparency also in the consideration of alternatives, how far these valuable habitats then are affected during construction and during operation of the highway, and how and really also to give this away in the way they make the decisions on the alternatives. Going from climate change mitigation then to adaptation, this is an example again from UK and this Northern Line. We see in a systematic way how they approached the impacts. So according to impacts of floodings and temperature changes, and also drought and severe heat waves, for instance. It's too small, but just to see as a way how this is more systematically done, and to then integrate all these different extreme events and climate stressors in a way. Yeah, so far looking at EIA and what was needed to consider climate change, and already at that time when we started to ask and question this, we got many voices, answers who said that EIA might not suffice. So as this quote here says, it's relevant to consider climate change in EIA. However, we need to start 2 steps earlier at SEA level and to consider it appropriately. And therefore also I will now go a step on the superior planning level and just shortly also reflect on the necessity to integrate climate change at these levels, as we might be able to achieve more really, especially in mitigation, more demand topics, and also combine more, yeah, maybe also opportunities and alternatives at these levels. So this is an example from transport planning, where I was also personally involved in with and several other colleagues, and where we asked to integrate climate change mitigation goals more into national transport schemes, and to give them more weight. And there exists both an SEA and an EIA, and finally the question was more how to start and how these can be linked better together. And actually then we found out that there's just not an SEA for a proper instrument at the superior level. So this was really a lack of the instrument which would really assess the changes in mobility options and all these properly. And for those documents which are at a very long period remaining, nevertheless, we saw that it would be really important that at least they consider at a more strategic level already the climate goals, and then allow an appropriate tiering really to these project related topics which then remain. And at this project level, then we would see that we can really deal with measures and more these technical issues, while at the other level, only they are possible, for them it's really possible to see what alternatives to a single highway is possible. And also for both really to start at scoping more, to integrate these topics together with other topics, and also in the methodological approach to give them the way in the trade-offs which are made, and of course in the alternatives. And similar to transport planning, SCA is very often applied in spatial planning, and also spatial planning decisions again then have very often an impact or lead to projects subject to EIA. So also here we would have a great opportunity for tiering again. And in Austria and also Germany, we had a lot of projects dealing how also SCA could then be an instrument which tries to integrate more benefits, also from looking also at other matters and other disciplines. So for instance, the connection to forestry, water management, or geology or nature conservation topics. So theoretically, and again with the participation of several, you see here it's quite a large area. The Austrian project I show about 4 million people and more than 700 municipalities in these areas, and very diverse natural and climatic conditions. And here it was a very diverse group of authorities from very different fields, and really interesting discussions how to integrate all the different information to really tackle climate change, and what could be a role of an instrument such as the SCA to coordinate all more this information and to integrate then also the measures adequately. So to speak, of course, primarily nature-based solutions, which then would be spatially relevant and would be more in the field of the SCA, coordinating water topics, soil, and also landscape issues, and so on, in preventative management of space and reduction of sealing, or then more small-scale green and blue infrastructure to integrate also more strategically and connect them better together, and also thereby consider more the interrelationships. And then again, it's the ideal way that then this implementation would help also at a later level, at project level, that it makes sense that some measures are integrated more in a larger connectivity of measures. This is just to show a scheme which then was developed to, how to say, SEA could cooperate better with spatial planning procedures, and also how climate change related information and opportunities could then be introduced more into planning again. So theoretically, this was perceived very well. Practically, we still saw, and also from the feedback from the experts, then from practice, of course, that SEA there's a lot more that it's really applied at the appropriate level, that this tiering of the measures then would really work out, and still, as particularly also that cumulative effects and interrelationships are more considered than in real practice, planning practice. And to conclude, and I think this might be also a link to the afternoon sessions, I want to highlight also the role of SEA in fostering more integrative planning approaches to reduce conflicts. In the talk before, we heard already about social relevant conflicts of, for instance, renewable energies and developments, and there are much more also interrelating social and environmental and health issues, and also with these new RED 3 and acceleration areas topics and so on. So I think there's a huge variety of topics where we need to consider at which level we can ideally tackle them. And of course, also as we face the pressure on EIA to be even faster and more streamlined, then it's the big discussion: what's the role of SEA and how it can help to maintain a certain transparency, and also from social health and also from a environmental perspective, really a sustainable energy transformation, for instance. Yeah, so to sum up, and it's a complex slide, I know, but it's just meant to show and to remind us again on the opportunities if we start at scoping level, and would also consider, like we saw in the German example, for instance, also log-in effects vary from the beginning. Often EIA or SCA or ESIA anyway, and then also the strong opportunities in the consideration of alternatives to consider climate change topics also together with other important issues, and to make trade-offs more visible. And then the very strong and necessary role of the monitoring, because we have so much complexity and uncertainty. But as also mentioned before, also we might have help from novel technology and novel opportunities to support us to overcome and to at least then also trace what happens and how our measures succeed. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm very happy also to get into direct contact. So if you're interested to find out more, you're also happy to contact me directly, and looking forward to questions and feedback.
Well, thank you very much for that very, very interesting presentation. So we're very, very way, I think, away from our scheduled time, but I think a few questions from the audience are due. So
concern with is I think everyone is listening to me, right?
yeah, okay, but it's online.
Okay, all right.
So if you can say your name and affiliation.
My name, okay. So my name is Sergio. I'm a social
social psychologist. I'm a social performance practitioner. And I've been doing social impact assessment for a few years now. And yeah, one of my concerns with social impact assessment, particularly, in the Portuguese experience, so bringing the Portuguese experience into the realm of our conversation, is how the incentives are set up. So the incentives there are three parts here. So it's the incentives for the proponents of the projects, for the owners of the projects, so the incentives for the regulators, and then the incentives for the communities. And the way this is playing out in Portugal is that both regulators and project proponents, they have a different set of incentives than the communities, and that's why social dimension is not part of the culture of impact assessment in Portugal. And from your experience, my question is, how can we lobby this around? It's been 20 years in this field, and it's still a very dire situation. Yeah.
So I told the story about international standards, with the encouragement that this should be a level of awareness that good companies would see the wisdom and would do it properly. But as you say, not all companies are good companies, and sometimes there are perverse incentives to do not the best. All right. So this is where we do need a system of pressure. So that's why the concept of who are the regulators of today, communities regulate companies to some extent. Communities demand better practice. Communities and NGOs pressure governments to regulate as well. I'm not anti-regulation, and I'm also in favor of compulsory SAA as well, right? But in the absence of it being compulsory in most jurisdictions, there nonetheless has been a groundswell of commitment to SAA being done, right? And with the Equator Principles and banks demanding proper management of environmental and social issues, this also has been a process. I mean, banks wouldn't do that if governments demanded it properly anyway. So we have to, that's why I put such a strong, passionate plea. All projects create negative social impacts, and all projects need to manage their negative social impacts much better. And collectively, we need to push greater awareness of this, because it's not being done properly. And it's not only Portugal, by the way. All countries have got bad experiences. All countries could do it better.
More questions? Okay, so I will take the prerogative of being the chair, and I also have a follow-up from Sergio's question. So you're advocating for a bottom-up approach so it's about communities, and it's about watchdogs actually making the claim and requesting and requiring that SIA there would be a significant step up. But from practice, what we see is actually lenders' requirements being the most influential. So it's at the policy level that you get the requirements for best practice and for implementing social impact assessments. Also, the voluntary schemes from corporate policies. Well, they're market driven, but they're also quite top down. So how do we do this step from actually getting regulators and national level EIA systems to incorporate and require the international best practice? So how do we turn that voluntary process or the top level requirement and transform it into legal requirement on EIA systems? How do we bridge that gap?
Well, I think a multi-pronged approach is needed, and I am advocating for a bottom-up approach, but also bottom-up is demanding it as well, right? So it's not just me advocating this; it's a groundswell movement of demand. Actually, there is a concept in this field called social license to operate. It's a little bit of a controversial concept because quite a few academics are opposed to the notion. But the idea of the concept of getting a social license to operate, it's a bit like a legal license to operate is what you get when you go through the regulatory process. A social license to operate is when a company undertakes procedures to know that it has social approval, right? And to connect to your story, then an extension of that is a social license to operate and grow. Companies can't expand their operations. They can't move to new sites if they have a bad reputation, right? If we're much more selective in how companies and projects get approval for projects, then their reputation in other places becomes important too. So this social license to operate and grow, this creates the incentive for companies to do it properly. In conjunction with this there's a change in culture in companies about what it is to be a company. It's no longer the business of business to do business. It's the business of business to contribute shared value, to make a positive contribution to companies. The more that the corporate rhetoric changes to say it's not just about profit making that we assess companies for, it's what their contribution to communities is, right? And the more that shareholders, the public generally, as well as the board, have that as their view, right? The more we have, it's the job of every company to be a social enterprise, right? Changing the perspective of what business is. It's not the day of cowboy operators being exploitative and extracting wealth at the expense of the communities is over. We're not tolerant of that anymore.
Any other questions? Right, maybe just one for Alexandra. That's all right. Can you bear with me for a few minutes more? Okay. Right. So in Frank's presentation, we saw the reindeer handbook, and that remind me of a presentation that that was at the IAI conference a few weeks ago, where somebody was showing us the case of the Sami people in Sweden and Finland. So the Sami people, they are indigenous peoples from the Arctic. They are herders of reindeer. And there's this project that's a coal mine extraction project that is displacing those communities and the migration routes of these reindeer, right? So that's affecting that community. So this is a social project, a social problem. But then there's the interesting bit about this presentation was that there was a very interesting link with climate change, in the sense that with climate change, the pastures where these reindeer are feeding on, as with the increasing temperatures, they get a very thick layer of ice below the snow. So the reindeer cannot feed on the grass below. So the pastures, the areas where they can graze are changing. So there's a adding effect between the being displaced from their traditional routes and also climate change effects. Okay, so the question to you really, Alexander, is just a comment on whether you've seen social impacts at the climate change level, social impacts at European level on Austria and Germany, but maybe you can comment on other aspects, because most of the time when we're discussing climate change, it's either biophysical, greenhouse gases here, greenhouse gases there, and not so much the social dimension of it. So could you give us some comments on that?
I mean, yeah, so I think I might come back to topics which are both social, but also, of course, pure health issues. So if you think about the water scarcity topics, and even in Austria, we will have, and we already have in some parts, to make a trade-off at some periods, whether we use it for economic reasons to water, I don't know, golf courses, so golf fields, or to use it really as a drinking water reserve and resources. This is maybe one of the very core essential resource questions which then come up, and then there are many more which are more, as you say, linked to traditional or way how communities are affected, of course also directly by natural hazards, and then they also are very much impaired by their access to certain facilities, also social and health facilities, and all of these. Yeah, so I think there's a variety of interconnections between the biotic and abiotic resources, and then what it creates for the living conditions, yeah, affected by climate change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think we've pretty much ran out of our time. So I just want to thank both presenters today for their wonderful presentations and for sharing their understandings here today with us. And so thank you very much, everyone.